I don't say, oh, there it is. What's up, wrestling fans? I was right on top of it tonight. I probably went a little bit too early, didn't I? But what's up, wrestling fans? It's the Two Bros Wrestling Show, and I'm having technical difficulties. Kevin, what's going on, man?
All good on my end. No technical difficulties. We've rolled out the red carpet behind me, which I normally just reserve for our annual award show in January. But I thought it was appropriate to bring it out tonight because in our main event, we are talking WrestleMania's Hall of Fame, the 2024
Woo!
class. It's time to induct some men and women into the great class of 2024 for WrestleMania weekend. It's one of the most, for nostalgia buffs, old school wrestling fans, it's always a fun time. And we're going to talk about each member of the Hall of Fame, their biggest achievements, their moments that we remember, as well as what we think about their merit as whether or not they are Hall of Fame worthy to be inducted. So I'm sure you all have opinions on that as well. We want to hear them. Leave those in the comments. But Doug, before we do all that,
is it time for the?
It is time for the opening bell.
Let us begin.
And we will begin as we do most weeks now, and that is the latest on Vince McMahon's scandal. I'm sorry. It is the cloud that hangs over WrestleMania season and all of professional wrestling right now. But this week, we saw around the various interwebs snippets of Ronda Rousey's autobiography that's been making the rounds. Doesn't make Vince look very good from the bits that have been leaked. Pretty apparent, really, to any observer on screen that there were times during her run with WWE that Ronda Rousey was having a difficult time with management, that she did not exactly hide that she was not happy at times. In the excerpts we've seen from the book, it's pretty clear that the problem was Vince. Not that is terribly surprising to anyone, but in fact, she goes out of her way to praise Triple H as being one of the nicest guys on the business side of things, but definitely alludes to on-screen McMahon being pretty much the same guy she experienced backstage. Not much of a separation.
What is the quote? Yeah, hard to tell where the character ends and the real Vince begins because they're just so intertwined. Or so, I forget the exact quote that's floating around, but it's out there on the interwebs.
Yeah, that and a Palpatine comparison. So she's not pulling any punches on how she feels about Vince. No real specifics, at least from the snippets we've seen, but she does speak in some of these of there being a casting couch for female talent who pretty much had to do what they had to do in order to just get the screen time that they needed.
Right.
Pretty much just slammed WWE's whole historic culture of misogyny. Even the women's evolution is something she speaks of in terms of sort of Vince had his hands tied and he really couldn't fight it any longer and gave that credit to Triple H and Stephanie. But it should be interesting once the full book comes out to see if she starts naming names and gives specific examples, especially if those examples might help the ongoing legal case against Vince McMahon.
Yeah. Is there a quote where she's asked about the book and asked why there's not a lot about Laurinaitis or Bruce Pritchard? And she says the book's not big. There's not enough book for her to go into the two of them.
Yeah, it does make it sound like she's naming names there for sure. So it will be interesting to see what more comes out and who might end up getting involved in the case before all's said and done. But from the CEO, we have to talk about to the one that we want to talk about.
CEO.
We have a little more insight into Mercedes Moné's negotiations with both AEW and WWE. Essentially, she's been talking to both over the last 2 years. And WWE apparently got pretty aggressive there late in the process when it became pretty clear to them that she was leaning the other way. Ultimately, she did decide to go to AEW as the place that basically she saw more potential for herself, including the excitement that she had over the current AEW women's division. As far as the financial aspects of the deal goes, both AEW and WWE were both prepared to offer historic money. So Mercedes was going to be fine there, no matter which way she broke. No official word on what those figures might be. That has not been disclosed, though if this report is accurate, it would have her as not only the highest paid female in all of wrestling today, but likely the highest paid contract for a female in the history of the business. Good for Mercedes.
And I know I had called out the song last week and said I was not a fan of it, but I realized that just watching Dynamite, how actually brilliant the song is, because anybody who knows her as the boss does not know her as the boss anymore. They know her as CEO. And it's such an easy chant, and it's just so repetitive. It gets people. It programs any audience she's in front of. And I've got to say, I'm still a fan of the older theme, but I understand the logic of the new theme song.
And they're obviously in just two appearances that at this point we can judge upon, but in both of those, the CEO chants were pretty loud, allowing her to do the dance and apparently make that money. So
right.
Good for her, walking out, betting on herself, and coming out big at the other side of it. So congratulations on that. Someone else I'd like to see come out on the other side of things, Doug. Our next news story here concerns one Jungle Jack Perry. We have not seen old Jungle Jack on AEW since this infamous backstage incident that led ultimately to the firing of CM Punk. At that time, Doug, you and I predicted that once Perry's suspension was lifted, he would be welcomed back as a liberator for ridding the locker room of the cancer that was CM Punk backstage at AEW. That is not the way that it's played out. We're how many months into this and still no Jack Perry on TV?
Right.
I mean, he's still under contract. In fact, he's under contract even though he's appearing in New Japan at the same time. Right. So he's popped up on New Japan using a gimmick where he goes by the nickname The Scapegoat, which may not be that subtle of a rib, especially when it applies to his employer, Tony Khan in particular. So the Wrestling Observer had a story out this week that is basically saying that CEO Tony Khan continues to hold a grudge against Jack Perry, and that's why they have no indication at this time that they will be using him at all, because you cost me CM Punk.
Did he really, though? I mean, did he really?
Yeah.
I mean,
and if so, maybe a thank you instead of get over it.
Right.
I mean, it's ridiculous.
I just shake my head and I'm like, is this a work? Is it what is going? What are we watching here? Is this real? Because I don't know. If anybody, I'm not going to get into a CM Punk rant. We're talking Hall of Fame later, so
that's right. We got good stuff coming. This will be something that is a must watch come April 1st. Bray Wyatt documentary is premiering on Peacock the week before Mania. The documentary on Bray, real name Wyndham Rotunda, will be narrated by no less than Mark Calloway, aka The Undertaker, which Undertaker doesn't do this sort of thing. So that shows pretty mad respect right there. Documentary also includes modern interviews from both Bray's widow, JoJo Offerman, who some may remember from her days as a ring announcer in NXT, as well as Bray's brother, Taylor Wyndham, who wrestled in WWE under the name Bo Dallas. So Wyndham Rotunda, of course, passed away in August last year at the early age of 36. This documentary, Doug, is must-see TV. I used to, one of my favorite things about the original WWE network was some of their, even if it was biased and slanted always from a WWE lens, their original documentary programming were, in addition to the NXT and the pay-per-views, that was the main reason that I thought it was a good deal. They don't do nearly as many of these types of shows anymore.
Yeah, and I do really like the documentaries, the behind-the-scenes stuff like that. And you're right, it's just not our WWE network, Kevin.
It is not. This one will be, though, as a
Yep.
great lead up into WrestleMania. So we'll definitely all be watching that. Speaking of things that we're watching, or rather things that people aren't watching, there is obviously no Collision this weekend, probably for the best, because last weekend's was one of the lowest watched in the show's short history. 393,000 people were all that tuned in, despite being live after several weeks of taped episodes. Unfortunately, it had to go up against a big night of basketball, did not work out in its favor. AEW will have the same problem when they return March 30th, as it will be the second weekend of March Madness at that point. And then the weekend after that, I don't know what's on that Saturday, a little pay-per-view they're going head-to-head with. WrestleMania, night one. The
I hope that,
trouble with running Saturday shows, Collision.
yeah, absolutely.
The bad Collision ratings are likely to continue for some time, at least looking ahead the next few weeks.
If only Jack Perry hadn't run off CM Punk.
If only.
Jack,
Hey,
what have you done? AEW could have totally crushed WrestleMania night one.
Easily with Punk on the card in the main event, which he always was when he was
Absolutely.
on Collision.
Punk and FTR in the main event again.
Last week, we talked a bit about AEW and WWE trolling us by secretly being friends. We were kidding, sort of kidding, but the odd WWE name drops continue. This week, Michael Cole, when trying to hype up the brother versus brother Uso match, brought to mind the Hardys and the Hardy Boys big match that they had against one another at WrestleMania. So the playful mystery continues. I'm sure at this point they're just trying to troll us.
Man, I'm telling you, Triple H gets it. And the reins are off, right? The chains are off, the reins are off. He's making wrestling he's always wanted to see too. Where you acknowledge, the world outside your giant corporate bubble.
Which is actually pretty easy to do when you are in the giant corporate bubble.
Exactly. I mean,
what do you have to lose?
Exactly.
Yeah, Triple H does get that, but it is fun, and I thought worth noting that it has happened again. We're going to end tonight's opening bell segment with a get well soon to Raquel Rodriguez. I presume it's a get well soon. So we're big fans, obviously, here. Admire her courage for climbing back in the ring after the reveal of having a bad case of mast cell activation syndrome. Raquel, though, has now been pulled from the active Raw roster. The reason has not been divulged, but we do know she obviously had that flare up that she was pretty public about when she traveled to Elimination Chamber. And then she recently shared, as of last week, she was starting hyperbaric oxygen therapy for her condition. So it's very likely that her being off the roster has something to do once again with her mast cell activation syndrome, which she has not been back on active roster very long. That's flared up again. So considering she's still young in the business with a very high ceiling, here's hoping that she's able to get this under control, that we don't use the best possible years of Raquel Rodriguez to this condition she's battling. So best of luck to her, and hope that she returns to us soon.
Yes.
And with that, Doug, we're getting ready to talk the WWE Hall of Fame. Over the last few years, we have done a show where we have analyzed each of the inductees. Tends to be one of our more highly engaged with shows of the entire year. So I know we're not the only one that finds this part of Mania weekend a nice bone that they throw to old school fans. And we're happy to be able to talk about a full class, which is something that last year we, were worried about. Obviously, WWE was a little preoccupied behind the scenes with a particular business maneuver. But this year they filled up the Hall of Fame. We're going to talk about each member one at a time. Doug, we got graphics.
Nice. Well done, good sir. Well done. And I see we're starting out with the Mama Rock here, or I'm sorry, Grandma Rock.
We are starting with someone that, as of this recording, has actually not been made official, but it is very, very strongly rumored and talked about that Leah Maivia is getting inducted to the Hall of Fame this year. So I know it's unofficial, so we'll say that caveat, but not just because it's rumored. This past week, Cody began evoking her name as a good woman he refused to talk bad about. So that's a likely lead in. When you start talking about, when you start talking about someone's mother, that's going to lead to the grandmother. They're evoking families. I think that's how we ultimately get Leah Maivia announced as the final inductee for this year's class.
Yeah. I agree. This is happening. I mean, there's too much bloodline, and I don't know. There's you can almost weave a storyline around this too, with The Rock being what I called him last week, God King of Titan, when it's actually God King of TKO. But
we know what you meant.
Yeah, but Titan's the WWE. But this I think this is a lock, and maybe by the time we're this is happening. I'm calling it. This is happening.
You have everyone there. You're not always guaranteed with the Rock schedule that he's going to be available.
Right.
I guess my only concern would be, because he is a heel right now, that they might be concerned that people would heel on the induction. But I think that most wrestling fans are respectful enough to know the difference between the scripted parts and the real parts, and that they would not, make that mistake.
And you also have Cody already, laying some groundwork there too, talking about what a good woman she is to, and you got Cody signing off on her, being legit and a decent person, as opposed to her grandson, not so much.
He was talking about. Now I think about. He would think he was referencing mom, but I'm thinking grandmom is coming into this as well.
Yeah.
Because it is all the start of the bloodline. As far as Leah Maivia's qualifications, you see right there, she was the wife of the High Chief, Peter Maivia. And that is where this whole bloodline business starts, is with the High Chief. And when the High Chief died in 1982, Leah took over Polynesian Pro Wrestling, which was the promotion out of Hawaii that High Chief had ran. And it was notable because there was not a lot of female wrestling promoters at the time. It has always been a male-dominated business, especially in the 70s and 80s. And this was a lady who did not need to try and get respect from the boys that worked for her. She was a highly respected person, not just because she was the widow of Peter Maivia, because she was not a pushover. She was a tough cookie.
I imagine, being a wife in that business and so intertwined with it, you got to be a pretty tough cookie. Wife, child, you come up in the business, you're gonna.
It was an era too when the territories such as hers were getting snuffed out left and right by WWE, who was Vince buying everything up at the time. He did not do that right away with her. In fact, Vince, Leah had Vince's respect. I think there was probably part of that, though, was the fact she was so far off his radar geographically,
right?
Being all the way out in Hawaii. It wasn't uncommon for Vince to actually allow WWE wrestlers to appear on her shows, knowing that no one would see them outside of the island. The NWA also didn't, obviously it was a territory system at that point in time still, but NWA stars would appear on the same cards with WWE stars in Hawaii because, again, you're off everyone's radar over there.
Right.
Doug, I have to say, I would, as far as personal recollections, which I know is one of the things we're talking about with each of our inductees, I would not really have known who Leah Maivia was if it wasn't for Rocky and especially the Rock. Polynesian Pro Wrestling wasn't on our TV, so it wasn't on our radar.
No, it definitely was not. It didn't make it to this side of the country for sure.
It did not, and so I probably would not have known her. I read about all the different promotions and the after mags, as they were called, of the day. But really, I think that my familiarity with the Leah Maivia story was probably mostly groomed by the NBC series Young Rock. Yeah.
I was gonna say I've not seen a lot of episodes of Young Rock, but the ones I have, she's featured prominently in them.
Between that and the Tales from the Territories that they did on Polynesian Pro Wrestling is really my that's the entire scope of what I have learned about Lia Maivia. Obviously, Young Rock's super helpful in telling that incredible story of his grandmother at a time when women weren't maybe right there,
Right.
respected. But Hot Summer Night, there in those bullet points, that was a card that they had where, as I mentioned, WWE and NWA superstars intermingled. Biggest show in the history of Polynesian Pro Wrestling. This is the mid 80s when Vince was stamping everyone out. They had 20,000 people in a stadium in Hawaii.
Nice.
And I mean, that's a mega event at a
Yeah.
time when it's common now. That was pretty rare back then for an independent promotion to be able to pull off things like that.
Absolutely.
Last thing I will say about Lia, because I think it's just an interesting side note. We said she was no wallflower and was a tough cookie. So she was once you see it on the screen there. She was once indicted by the FBI, had to return to Samoa to face these charges. But the case basically centered on the way the old territory system pretty much was ran, like the mafia. So promoter wanted to do a show there in her territory in Hawaii, and I guess did not want to pay the customary kickback that you should if you're coming into someone else's territory. Led to some extortion charges, as well as an alleged threat on a physical harm of this particular gentleman.
She was hardcore. I love it.
I mean, I love it. It's a great story.
Great. That is a great story. It's such a wrestling story too, from back in the day.
And if Young Rock's to be believed, and of course sometimes they do embellish on the show for comedy purposes, but she basically went from the I'm going to bust this guy's kneecaps kind of threats to playing the part of elderly grandmother and just absolutely cutesied up the jury who acquitted her as this sweet little old lady.
Sure, I wish she wouldn't. I mean, look at her. She's not going to bust anybody up, or she may send some of the boys over to do it, but she's not going to do it.
She worked that. She worked that jury like she worked the promotion. But Doug, I know we don't have a ton of personal interactions in our youth with the work of Lia Maivia, but I think just based on what she represents as the matriarch of a family that has done what it has done in wrestling, the fact that she stood out at a time as a true trailblazer for women in the business when they weren't allowed on the business side, I'm going to say she's worthy. I don't see why anyone would think otherwise.
Absolutely. I'm all in on this one. Yeah, because just what she accomplished when she accomplished it, that's it, virtually unheard of.
Which takes us to our next inductee. And this is always one where I sometimes question whether or not it's someone who's worthy, just because I'm not a fan of the celebrity wing of the WWE Hall of Fame. The WWE Hall of Fame, in general, in my mind, should be to those that contributed to the business. We have a sort of a different scenario here, because you can make an argument that Muhammad Ali was a fan who contributed to the business. Obviously, everyone knows Muhammad Ali from his boxing career, but he had his wrestling moments.
And he is the OG People's Champion too.
The greatest of all time. So, boxing, especially if you're on the younger side, you might think of boxing as this antiquated thing compared to mixed martial arts or UFC. But there was a time that whether you were a boxing fan or not, you knew who the heavyweights, the stars of that day and era were. Everyone knew Muhammad Ali. Everyone watched boxing to a certain extent back, through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And Muhammad Ali is considered possibly the greatest boxer to have ever lived. Sure. He cut promos, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, the greatest of all time. mostly back in those days, men came to the ring, they fought, they left. Muhammad Ali brought that wrestling flair, and he was pretty honest about where he got it all from. It was watching Gorgeous George back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
It was seeing that if I want to make money, I need to sell you to come take that seat. And it doesn't matter to me if you love me or you hate me. So he
Exactly.
was quite often an antagonist. He was a heel.
And that's what I was gonna say. What a wrestling mindset! I don't care if you love me or hate me. I'm playing a character. I'm here to get paid. You know, either way, you're going to come see me. You either want to come see me get beat or you want to come see me win. Either way, you're paying to come see me. You know?
And pay to come see him, they did. I remember my own father not liking Muhammad Ali at the time. I think that might have, the respect might have been there and changed. But when he went from Cassius Clay and, he made some of his, controversial social protests when he won, at the Olympics. I mean, there was a lot that Muhammad Ali was ahead of his time on and took a big stand and risked his whole career. And I know we're talking about his, his accolades in boxing. Obviously, 3-time world heavyweight boxing champion, considered maybe the greatest to ever do it. But wrestling wise, he had that history too, not just because he was inspired by it, but there was a fight that took place in Tokyo where he fought Antonio Inoki. And this was because Inoki at the time was promoting catch wrestling, promoting, that wrestling was the superior art form and would have these exhibition fights against people from other combat disciplines. And when, of course, you get a star, the stature of Muhammad Ali, it was a forebearer to, I mean, what do we call that today? It's mixed martial arts. It's UFC.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really I did not realize he did this with Inoki, but that's great because it's MMA, like you say. They were such a trailblazer to be cutting promos in wrestling. Basically, the godfather of MMA.
Yeah.
And of course, we can't forget his like the next bullet point you have listed, the first WrestleMania main event.
He was there. He was the special referee for that contest. Doug, I don't know if you have any personal recollections of Muhammad Ali. I know we would have both been young during Ali's heyday as a fighter, but I do remember boxing being a big deal. And when I say everyone watched boxing, I mean everyone from my sweet little grandparents who were the most nonviolent people you could think of. On Saturdays, you'd see them watching boxing. I remember specifically when I would go get my hair cut in downtown Logan, like there was a series of barber chairs, and it was a place where people would hang. Men would hang and smoke and talk. And if it was a Saturday or a weekend, there was boxing on, or we were talking boxing. And I remember a lot of conversations on Muhammad Ali. And how he ranked in, these they were old men then in the 70s and 80s. So, but yeah, it was just kind of a nice memory I have when I think Muhammad Ali or really, really young Mike Tyson. I remember all those days in the barbershop here and these old guys talk about boxing and thinking like I felt really adult just being in the presence of those conversations.
Yeah, that is kind of cool. You mentioned being really adult because it's in my mind now. It seems like boxing back in the day. If you really want to see the good boxing, like not something like a Saturday afternoon kind of boxing, but like the real big deal kind of stuff, it was like almost like these HBO special kind of things, and that was like a really big deal because HBO had the adult stuff. you know, but
Was your
I think I remember.
was your father a boxing fan?
No, I'm not a big sports fan. In my house growing up, the sports were either scripted with predetermined outcomes or involved vehicles. So
I understand that.
either going in a straight line or making a continual left turn. But I do remember, almost more so any sports related things. Like nightly newscast, that 6:30 national news, and Ollie being on that a lot, or at least in my mind at this point, he was on there a lot. That's where I got most of my exposure, where he's cutting promos, and they're talking about because this dude was a big deal, and they're talking
He
about
was a big deal.
I mean, how many boxers make the nightly news, like almost weekly now?
And I mean, I know the sports profile has fallen quite a bit, but I honestly could not tell you right now, gun to my head, who the current heavyweight boxing champion is. Even if you didn't watch boxing back in the day, you knew when Muhammad Ali was on top, or George Foreman was on top, or Sonny Liston was on top. Like, people knew who these folks were. As you said, they kind of transcended. Muhammad
Right?
Ali, particularly with what he represented and his social activism, he truly transcended. And for me, I'm going to make my vote here on, I say, worthy. I know that celebrity wing is kind of a iffy proposition for me, but I think unlike others who are a stretch to try to tie to pro wrestling, with Muhammad Ali, you can clearly show where he took inspiration from wrestling. And then there are multiple examples of him giving back to the sport of pro wrestling. So if you're going to have a celebrity wing, I say Muhammad Ali deserves to be in it.
I cannot disagree with that, man. Cannot disagree with it.
Well, with that, let's move to our first professional wrestler that we're going to be talking about tonight, and that is Bull Nakano. She is for sure a pioneer. You look at this picture of Bull Nakano, if you're not familiar or didn't see Bull Nakano back in the day, she looks like the type of heel that would get an opportunity today. Not really so much back in the day when she did, when this was not what a female wrestler looked like. And I don't mean that in any sort of derisive way, just a statement of fact. People did not look like Bull Nakano, or people who did look like Bull Nakano were not allowed to be on in the women's matches prior to the last 6-7 years, really. So she obviously was a trailblazer, but unlike I have to say, my memories of Bull are pretty limited. I don't know about you, Doug.
I don't know who this is. I know. You're as far as I know, you may be punking me right now. I don't know who this person is. I legit don't, and I'm embarrassed that we have a wrestling show and I do not know this person who's being inducted into the Hall of Fame. But yeah, no, I'm looking down through here going, well, this is odd that they're recognizing a Japanese wrestler who's never been in the WWF or E, but she has, because apparently she's a former champion. And I love the last, also a pro golfer.
She did. Later on in life, after her wrestling career is over, she actually went on the LPGA tour. She was apparently that good. It is not anyone's fault if, like Doug, you don't know who Bull Nakano is, only because her time in America was brief. But most of her work is in Japan, all Japan, and pro wrestling to be specific. She began there as a teenager. She won multiple championships while in Japan. She came to the North American continent, couldn't find work in the United States, which is understandable considering how closed down our country was at that time to female wrestling. She went to Mexico, became the first CMLL women's champion, and then she did have that run in WWF, which is what I remember of her. I recall her feud with Alundra Blaze is really the only personal at the time kind of memories I have, which apparently is one more memory than Doug has.
I mean, I forget a lot of things now, but I don't think this lady was ever in my brain.
As far as worthiness goes, this one is a little more borderline for me just because her work in the U.S. was limited, but that hasn't precluded others from being invited into the fold. Obviously, from your Antonio Inokis on down, there's other performers from Japan. There's other performers, whether you're talking NWA or WCW. We know that it's a wrestling Hall of Fame, that they have not limited themselves to people who had big impacts in the WWE or WWF. So even though to me this one's a little more on the borderline side, I could not really argue against her inclusion, if only for based on her work in Japan, Mexico, and the generation of women wrestlers who wanted to get physical, which was Bull Nakano's style. It undoubtedly inspired others who would later build upon her path to have the variety and diversity in women's wrestling we have today.
I don't want to disagree with you, but I
but you don't know who that is.
I have a problem agreeing with you because I don't know. I can't register a single contribution, in any way, because I know nothing about Bull Nakano. So if you say she's legit, I believe your brother.
She is legit. She just was not on our shores very often. Again, this is where it gets into the murky waters of what is a WWE Hall of Fame, what is a Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, what is a Pro Golfing Hall of Fame. But
I mean, for all I know, she was a better pro golfer than she was a wrestler. I don't know.
This one is on the cusp for me, but I would give a yay vote, and Doug's going to have to abstain just from lack of knowledge of Bull Nakano. But it does give us some homework, right? Go look up Bull Nakano if you're not familiar, and find some matches online. See what you think.
And if anybody can point me in the direction of some Bull Nakano matches to go watch, please drop them in the comments.
Absolutely. Now, Doug, this next one, and I know sometimes when I say I'm a little older than you remind me that I'm not that much older, but as we have noticed a few times in our conversations on this show, between when a particular wrestling show arrived on what limited channels we had, and then that extra couple of years I had on you, sometimes that swing of 3 or 4 years and access can make a world of difference in what one of us remembers and what the other one remembers.
And it's certainly going to with Thunderbolt here too.
I had a feeling that might be the case, because this is when we're starting to get into the wrestlers whom I have much more familiarity with, because when I first started watching wrestling, which may have been slightly before Doug, I remember Thunderbolt Patterson. He was a mainstay of the territory days. I first saw him on Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling in the early 1980s. Do you remember exactly when? I mean, I know we say 80s, but isolated to a year, would you even have an idea about what year wrestling popped on your radar?
Gosh, I don't even know. I had to be like 8 to 10, so maybe between 80 and 83, somewhere in there.
Okay.
But because some of my earliest memories of wrestling were with, I've talked about it before, like Ricky Steamboat, Jay Youngblood, feuding with Sergeant Slaughter and like Corporal Khrushchev, the miser, on my screen a lot when I was a kid,
but you don't remember
but I don't remember Thunderbolt. No, Mike Dolgendorf. These are names I can roll off, and people are like, "Who?" But Thunderbolt should probably be on that list. But I have no record. I don't know who this person is either. Is he also a pro golfer? I don't know.
I don't know what his golf game was like. I just remember that he was always mid card. He was never the star, but he always was solid. He was usually a fan favorite, not always a fan favorite. And I found him entertaining. I remember that. It was kind of an interesting case with Thunderbolt, though, because, as much as anything, it's some of his people who note him as an influence. So Thunderbolt, obviously a black man who primarily wrestled in the South in a time that was not an easy thing, came at the audience with a very preacher-like persona as far as his speaking style. It was the old Southern black church, which Dusty Rhodes would give credit to Thunderbolt for strongly influencing his own promo style. Which I do remember that Thunderbolt could be kind of captivating on the microphone. He's an interesting footnote too into the formation of the Four Horsemen. So he was in a tag team with Ole Anderson. They were They were actually like a national tag team champions, and Ole did the turn on Thunderbolt, saying he was tired of carrying people like Thunderbolt Patterson and Dusty Rhodes, and so he brought in family to to take over. Of course, that family would end up being Arn Anderson, and that was the start of what would end up ultimately becoming the Four Horsemen. So Thunderbolt gets a little bit of a footnote to the history of the Four Horsemen.
Interesting.
The last thing I would point out about Thunderbolt that I did not know at the time and only know by doing the research for this show is that bullet point there on his time being blackballed in the 1970s. That blacklisting is because he apparently wrestled for a promotion for a friend, and this promotion was not under the banner of the National Wrestling Alliance. Thus, it was considered an outlaw promotion. Again, these things were ran tight like mafia fiefdoms, right? So it pretty much led to him being blackballed. Part of it also apparently was the amount of complaining that Thunderbolt supposedly did. He had the gall to complain about the racial discrimination in the National Wrestling Alliance.
How dare he do such a thing? Come on.
As well as the lack of a wrestling union, which is something he fought for.
Wow.
So
there's a trailblazer. Wow. Okay.
In the 1970s, to be a black man from the South who actively is taking on the major promotion of the South at that time for racial discrimination and for lack of insurance and a union for wrestlers, that's pretty progressive.
That's incredibly progressive. For that alone, I should probably abstain since I have no knowledge of this guy either. But for the Four Horsemen and being so socially conscious, in a time when it could get him into a lot of trouble considering who he was and where he was, and pushing for a union all the way back then. Yeah, dude's got my vote.
Hey, for those trailblazing reasons alone, I too think. And then you look at the career. 30 years in the business. He was a mainstay around wrestling for a very, very long time, right through the old territory era, bringing us right on the cusp of what wrestling is today, bridging that gap, his influence on Dusty and others with his promo style. Right. I definitely think that Thunderbolt, I think he, not everyone is the headliner. Thunderbolt wasn't the headliner during his day. He's not the headliner of this class. Mm-hmm. In fact, most folks younger than Doug are not going to know who Thunderbolt Patterson is. He's not going to be a big draw to get people to tune into the Hall of Fame broadcast to hear about Thunderbolt Patterson. But interesting cat if you should dig into his story, and definitely worthwhile being honored, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And now we're going to see the first people that we're talking about tonight that Doug will actually recognize. You know those guys, Doug. You recognize those guys?
This is kind of weird though, because WWE was not, for me, and I think you too, we were Jim Crockett Promotions. That's what we had access to, because it was, gosh, I want to say I was in junior high, maybe even high school, before I got anything that had WWF on it, right? So a lot of this stuff I missed out or got to see later in life, with WrestleMania, who Captain Lou is. You know these guys. I mean, Bray Wyatt is named Wyndham Rotunda. Come on.
I think that I got WWF before you did, but there's no doubt about it that for both of these guys, they first appeared on my radar because of their work in the NWA, not the WWF. Right. That's where they went when Vince started buying everyone up. But I knew Mike first. He was, again, if you watched Mid-Atlantic, now, again, it depends on when you came into Mid-Atlantic, but if you recall, he almost started out as a jobber. He was this, I remember him as a guy who lost as much as he won, and then he started to turn that around, and it would be the opposite, where he would win more than he would lose. I recall liking his style because it was the style that I still kind of like. I'm not flashy, I just go in there, technical wrestle. He was doing that because he had a legit amateur wrestling background. Barry would come for me a little later because, again, I read all the magazines. I read about Barry. He was in Florida Championship Wrestling. So he wasn't there at the same time as Mike. But he would end up getting there, and I would see him in Jim Crockett Promotions and the NWA before they got together in WWF. How about you, Doug? Individual memories of Mike or Barry before WWE?
I'm actually struggling to pull individual memories, and I really can't, because I look at at Barry Windham, and I think he kind of has a bit of like a Greg Valentine look to him, but I know and I don't want to get those two confused, but I feel like if I start talking about him, I'm going to get the two just mushed together now because some like longish light colored hair. So I'm just
So
going to keep
really,
quiet.
then your first real memories of Mike Rotunda and Barry Windham were in WWF together?
I think in like retrospective WWF stuff, even because I remember more Mike Rotunda as the IRS, right?
So you don't remember Mike in WCW or
I,
NWA
I
before?
I really don't, because I'm struggling to,
Okay.
because no, I don't think I do.
So there was
I really don't.
with Barry, there's a really great match that he had with Ric Flair prior to the whole U.S. Express and um, days where it was on TV, which was rare at the time to see stars take on each other. Of course, it was a Flair match, so there was no definitive winner. It's like Wyndham pushed him to the time limit, or
Right.
Rick just barely escaped. Of course, Rick could make anyone look good, but Barry not only held his own, it was an impressive showing, and I'm like, okay, I like these guys. But I do remember them when they got together in WWF. Like you, more of an NWA guy, so I thought, oh man, why do they have to give him a gimmick? Well, just make them the Mike Rotunda and Barry Windham. That's who they are. Why do you have to call them the U.S. Express? But also in a time before wrestling promoters cared about music rights, and they would just play music and not worry about anyone calling them on it. The U.S. Express would come down to the ring to Born in USA. So
Of course they would.
1985 Kevin was all about the U.S. Express.
Of course. So, has Captain Lou always been associated with them, or what?
He was the manager, yeah, for the time, for most of that time. So at a certain point, Barry would return to the National Wrestling Alliance, and that's maybe where you probably are going to pick up on him. And they didn't miss a beat, because Rotunda just put in Dan Spivey, and they became the American Express. And Mike got another tag team title, WWF Tag Team Championship out of that, whereas Barry would go on ultimately now to be a two-time inductee into the WWE Hall of Fame, because he also was inducted as for his stint in the Four Horsemen, in one of the incarnations of the Four Horsemen. So this one's easy for me. Mike and Barry were legit close. They became brother-in-laws. With Mike naming one of his sons Wyndham, which is Doug pointed out, of course, the great Bray Wyatt. What I didn't realize, thinking that these two former NWA stars had been put together in WWF, they were, but they actually were former NWA United States Tag Team Champion in Championship Wrestling from Florida. They actually, in like 83 or so, were put together as a tag team in the NWA prior to the success they would later have in WWE.
I think it's so cool that these guys are like legit tied and been tied. I didn't realize they were brother-in-laws either, but I always thought it was really cool that back in the day they were a tag team, and Rotunda names one of his sons after Barry.
Because you always hear these stories of some of these tag teams that were thrown together, and the guys by the end of being on the road for 20 years together hated each other. They were put together, forced to be on the road all the time in the same car for year after year. These relationships, like marriages, or they get on each other's nerves, they crumble. Yeah, these guys end up like, one married the other's sister, and then they named one named his kid after his tag team partner. I mean, it's a beautiful story. And obviously, I think it's going to be an emotional night with everything that has happened over the past year with Bray. His dad's getting inducted. Barry's getting inducted for the second time over. This one is such an easy yes. It's one of the easier yeses in this year's class in my mind.
For me, totally Two, not because I clearly not because I remember all their early work, but because of what I've seen in retrospect of these two. And I always love a good story where because I love a good stable, and these guys aren't a stable, but tag teams fall into that too. In not really a stable, but that whole brotherly love kind of thing. And I always do love that. And when it's like legit like this, for that alone, I'm giving my thumbs up.
These guys are legit, and that brings us to one. And Doug, I think you're going to know this guy. You recognize him?
He was in Batman, wasn't he?
Oh, so close. I thought we had you one. I mean, we have to agree here that this is the headliner, right? This is the headliner of the class of 2024.
He has to be. Has to be. Yeah, I was watching something earlier on YouTube. I was just like a clip where it's got Tommy Dreamer, it's got Bully Ray. They're talking about Paul. Paul's up there. I'm presuming because it was just a short little clip about Tommy talking about basically how he loves and hates this man and is loyal to him to this day, and how this man has taught him so much and taught so many people so much. And then it goes on to something else. I'm like, I want to see more of this. They have to be talking about his induction and his Hall of Fame. But I mean, this dude.
So much on this screen we could dig into. I think I'm just going to start there at the beginning. The fact that you want to talk about the Hyman hustle, as it were called. At 13, the guy bought a photo lab and set off to go take pics of professional wrestlers because he'd seen Vince McMahon interview superstar Billy Graham on television and said, this is what I want to do with my life. By 14, he had hustled his way into credentials to go into Madison Square Garden and take pictures of these wrestlers.
At 14. MSG at 14. Man, come
on.
on.
Getting his photos published in Pro Wrestling Illustrated. I mean, if there was... You talk about someone who could inspire and work a gimmick and work the game from an early age. Paul Heyman was able to be that person. Mm-hmm. Obviously, this will get the attention eventually of promoters, and the rest is history. Doug, do you remember? I'm almost hesitant to ask about first memories. Because
I really want to tell you that I remember Paulie dangerously, but I don't. I
really don't remember Paulie dangerously.
I want to say that's another one of those in retrospect, that I've picked up on Paulie dangerously stuff. Really legit, like ECW is where my first real memories of Paul are from.
So I do think, I really do, even though we are around the same age and became fans around the same time, I do think that I had access a little sooner to a few more stations than where you lived.
I think I legit had like 8, maybe 12 channels total. Until maybe we met in high school.
I'm not trying to holler shame you or anything, because I mean I'd like.
Hey, I grew up in a trailer in Southern West Virginia. I own it, man.
It's all right. It is all right. I got a little bit of AWA at one point, and that was on ESPN when I had friends that I went to high school with that didn't have ESPN, which I know we sound like total ancients now to anyone watching this under 40 years of age.
I know. I just said I had like 8 to 12 channels, and everybody has like 5,000 channels now.
And some kids are going, "What's a channel?" Like, well,
exactly.
I don't even turn on the thing.
You can't stream that.
Paul came on my radar because of the AWA. The first time I remember Paul E. Dangerously was managing the Midnight Express in the AWA, which at the time was Dennis Condrey and Randy Rose, who would then become later in the NWA the real or original Midnight Express, as I think they would go call them at the time. But that's where I first experienced Paul E. Dangerously. But the main memories I had of him of that time was when he did come to WCW, the Dangerous Alliance. I have to be honest, when I first encountered Paul on WCW, I didn't know what to think. Again, I'm young, and all I thought was, This is a Jim Cornette clone. He's just replaced the tennis racket with the
phone.
big
I can see that.
phone.
Yeah. See, now Jim Cornette, I have vivid memories of that tennis racket. Paul and his phone, I can't remember.
And he came afterwards. We're
I
going to have to.
know. I know. I used to love Cornette and the tennis racket. I thought it was a great
Now,
gimmick, even when I
I
was a
will say
kid.
this. I don't know if you stuck with wrestling the whole time. I did have a brief period of time where I fell out of wrestling by the time I went to college. Paul would have been mainly on people's radars in that 90s era period when I was starting to get out of it and stopped watching as much. That couple of year gap I had were the prime Paul E. Dangerously WCW Dangerous Alliance years. So that could have affected you too
Maybe
if you weren't watching the full time.
probably because because
Now you mentioned ECW though. I didn't get ECW. I only saw clips of ECW. It was like the late period ECW when they finally got on like TNN and stuff that I had full-time access to ECW. Did you have ECW sooner?
I did not have ECW sooner. However, there was a period of time, and you may remember this, where I worked in television. I would work
Okay.
midnights, and there was this process. Like I'm not sure how it is today because this was very long ago, where you would record satellite programming, and then especially the syndicated stuff, right? And so there were a lot of satellites that would you could point the dishes at, and you're especially a guy like me who worked midnights, right? You had like a set of shows that you're going to go ahead and record because these are going to run in syndication throughout the week, so you get everybody ready for the rest of the week. I do this on the weekends, and on the weekends at 2 in the morning, I could always find, and the guy that worked before me that had like the evening shift was a huge wrestling fan too. So he turned me on to where I could find all the cool wrestling that was being broadcast and
Oh,
syndicated, so I could always watch ECW. You know, I mean, it wasn't running locally, but I could watch it on the satellite while I was recording my other programs and keeping the shows running that had to be on.
that
So
is cool.
so that's where, because that's where I first saw Taz too. And I was like, "Oh, what am I looking at here? What is going on? So that's Paul. That's Paul's contributions to my wrestling. That they start there with ECW, the product,
And this
and
is the one where the shoe's going to be reversed because you had access to something that I only saw clips of, and I remember seeing these clips and being both appalled and attracted at the same time. If I'm honest with you, because there was such a low budget
yes,
production to it, you look at it and you go, "This doesn't look like real professional wrestling. This looks like really cheap." Like look, and then you'd watch and
yeah,
then you'd see the stuff you would
and
never ever see on mainstream, and then suddenly it went from looking cheap to looking underground, which suddenly made it like
yes,
really cool to a
there
teenage boy.
there is that shift there because it goes from like really cheap and the production value is not there, and then you see Jerry Lynn and Van Dam going at it, or you see or New Jack doing something insane.
And that's the thing, man. It's the variety, right? Because I know that the knock on ECW was, oh, that's not real wrestling. They're just blood and guts, and and there
Mhm.
are truly folks in that promotion that it was obvious that the gimmick they were working was to hide the fact that they couldn't really
Right,
wrestle.
right.
But if you got beyond the whole blood and guts aspect, which I know brought a lot of people in, you would see that RVD Jerry Lynn match or Taz. I mean, I was exposed not just to the hardcore style,
Hmm.
which, is some people's style, is, not to everyone's taste. But then you did see someone wrestling a technical style like Dean Malenko or
Yes,
Taz, or
yes.
you'd see, the first real lucha style in American shores appeared in ECW. You realize this guy is reinventing the entire industry by bringing international styles to American soil. Super crazy, Tajiri. I mean, once I
Yes.
started to get these broadcasts, I could not get enough. This was the
Mhm.
wrestling I looked forward to most during the week. And you can say what you want about how he went bankrupt and the promises he made that he couldn't fulfill. He was definitely someone who was a great motivator, was not always great at paying his bills, but he kept these guys going when it was duct tape and string sometimes to get these shows going. And he started a revolution, and that is not an exaggeration. You would not have DX, you would not have the NWO, you wouldn't have the whole WWF Attitude Era had Paul Heyman not made everyone else look like children. But once ECW came about, everyone else looked like the past, and ECW began to look like the future, to the point that he pretty much had everything stolen out from underneath him, and they couldn't continue. But for that run alone, this dude would deserve to be in the Hall of Fame.
Absolutely, because I mean, it's such a visionary in the business, right? I mean, you see here, CWA, AWA, Jim Crockett Promotions, NWA, WCW, WWF, WWE. He has this. I mean, it was baked into him from an early age, and he got it. He got it early on. He knew how to turn it. He maybe was not the best businessman. Maybe couldn't turn the profits the way he needed to keep things, but he knew how to bring folks in and how to create something that people are going to continue to talk about, right?
And you're going through all that stuff there, and I'm almost embarrassed that I only have one bullet point there at the end that says modern WWE, because you run out of room. And when I say his role in modern WWE, I'm not talking about the bloodline and what he's doing right now with Roman. You could say the post ECW, the last 20 years of this man's career has mainly been in WWE, where he's worked as an announcer, he's worked as a backstage creative. He has worked as an on-screen character. He has worked as an unofficial advisor to anyone who had the wisdom to, ask for a little bit. There's a reason that the term Paul Heyman guy is a thing, because of how many wrestlers are in this business because Paul Heyman took notice of a particular skill they had, and he was able to harness it and share of his wrestling genius and put that person on the right path, because Paul was renowned in ECW for taking whatever you had and accentuating it, and whatever faults you had, being able to cover it up and hide it. And he continues to do that.
I mean, look at the classes from OVW when Paul was down there. I said I wasn't going to make this about Punk tonight, but I think Punk tells really great stories, and so does Paul about Punk, about how they would get together when they're in OVW down there, spending time. The first one's in the door, the last one's out, just setting. There's a reason guys like CM Punk are Paul Heyman guys.
There's a
this
reason.
Man is truly a wise man. The shaman of wrestling right here.
If you wanted to induct him just for his microphone work, you would have a great case. He is the best on the mic. You can't get any better. If you wanted to just induct him for his work back as a manager in WWE and in WCW back even further, he would be worthy. If you wanted to induct him for the revolution he started as a promoter and what he created with ECW, he would be worthy just for those things individually, much less when you take them all together. It's Philadelphia. So apparently he'd been asked in the past to be put in the Hall of Fame. He always turned it down. I think the fact that we're in Philly is why he said yes. This is the easiest yes on this list by far. You could choose any aspect, any bullet point on this list, and if you isolated it, I'd go, on that alone, he's worthy. And then there's all the others.
And we should also add one more bullet point. Doug knows who he is.
And he passed the test of the broader knowledge of Doug for Paul. Not Paul Dangerously, but Paul Heyman.
Yes. Because, Kevin, I think we can both safely say we are Paul Heyman guys.
We are Paul Heyman guys, Doug. I think we can safely say that not only is he the headliner, this is going to be the induction speech of the night as well. Oh, yeah. Already looking forward to that.
Yes.
And with that, what an entertaining and diverse class of 2024 we have. There is quite the diversity in this class, from relative unknowns, honestly, to the general wrestling public, to someone like a Paul Heyman, who's going to be your headliner, even though he doesn't wrestle. It's going to be an interesting watch.
Absolutely. Can't wait.
With that, Doug, we have to hit this finish so that we can get closer to Mania weekend. Let's talk watch of the week.
Let's do it. So I really, really love AEW. I really love wrestling. I really love what AEW has done. But, Tony Khan or whoever the idiots are in back that are booking that crap sometimes just make some very, very poor choices. You can't spend so much time and effort getting somebody over as such a bubbly baby face like Willow Nightingale, only to undo all that in seconds by having this very courageous, very brave, very bubbly, always positive baby face go tweener or almost heel and consider like attacking Monet from behind just because she called her out because they've got beef. No, you don't do that. This character that was so out of character, and it bugged me so much.
Because
Even
Willow is perfect is the way she's
yes,
presented. Yeah,
yes.
she
I
is.
mean, she doesn't need a Bailey makeover yet to flip her heel or anything like that. Absolutely not. And Mercedes does not need anybody to get her over. You don't need that either. Just just let these two fabulous women finish
Yeah,
their business, finish their
play it
story,
out.
right? Yes.
Play it
Yes,
out.
you don't need, I mean, wrestling at its core is a good versus evil. This person has something I want, or I have something they want, and we're going to settle our differences. It doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. If you do stupid things like this, you deserve those like three people watching.
I can't disagree with you there. And in fact, even though it's a different issue, I too am calling out for my botch of the week, Tony Khan. And in particular, from our news segment, I'm going to call out Tony Khan's grudge. So Jack Perry
Yeah.
did not cause you to lose CM Punk. Punk
No.
had a pretty famous dust up and physical altercation with the company's executive vice presidents. He also was very demonstratively and publicly insubordinate to Tony himself in a live public press conference.
Who sat there
So
paralyzed?
to pretend that Jungle Boy is the reason WWE has CM Punk is to ignore a whole lot of history and also require Tony Khan to look into the mirror is ridiculous. Right? That story, if there's truth to that story, it's ridiculous. That's my botch of the week. Let's bring back Jungle Jack and let's put him towards the top of the card as the hero that he should be.
I don't think we should bring back Jungle Jack. I think we should bring back Jack Perry. I think it could almost be a great rehab and a great transition for Jack Perry to go from Jungle Boy Jack Perry to Jungle Jack Perry to Jack Perry. It's almost
or the scapegoat.
The scapegoat. You bring him back as a scapegoat. That's fine. But yeah, stop. Yeah, look, like you said it. Look in the mirror. Come on.
Look in the mirror, Tony.
Yeah.
Performance of the week, Doug.
I'm going to wrap two up here together, and this may be unpopular. Let me just start off by saying I also really, really love Eddie Kingston. Really love Eddie, and I could almost call this a botch too, because Eddie is great. Eddie is so awesome. I love what Eddie and Okada did. I love that Eddie is almost like a Flair-like heel kind of thing with Okada. I know you weren't too happy with heel Okada, but I am loving heel Okada, especially when he does that grin, and it's like, ooh, I'm really enjoying Okada. So I'm going to go, performer, heel Okada, because I love that. Even the Bucks backstage promote, doing the production on it. It's almost Plan 9 good, right? It's to that level. and then I love that match. But the follow up, my one complaint with all that would have been the follow up, because Eddie's an afterthought all of a sudden. He's just like, boom, you're gone, Eddie. No, not even a reaction shot to Eddie losing or anything like that. It's just, here comes Pac. Here's it was a transition. From give Okada a belt so he can feud with Pac. I'm cool with that. Totally cool with that. Yeah. Eddie deserves better. I think I just made my performer / match of a secondary botch too. Yeah. But that's where
the angry old man.
At least I know the people. I know the people we're talking about now, so that's good, I guess.
Oh man, performance of the week for me is Pat McAfee. He's been a great addition to the announce desk, and that's just obviously he has a genuine closeness to Cole. I think that comes across in their chemistry, so they work well together. And I think that it also is maybe because where he has a life outside of WWE, and he is very well known as a podcaster and a broadcaster. I think that maybe he gets a little more leeway. They don't seem like they produce him as tightly because he'll say things that I know have to be off script that Vince would have been yelling at the day. Triple H probably he might cringe or something, but for the most part, like it's extremely entertaining, and he's also extremely funny. So we noted here recently some of his great lines, like finding out who Rhea Ripley's companion was at UFC. He was on that.
That's great.
I think this week he outdid himself. He was trying to establish Dom as a dirty heel and described him as the kind of guy who'd get booed at his own wedding. If you know, you know. If you don't, you weren't left confused. And that's usually the problem with insider comments is that it only plays to a certain audience while everyone else goes, what that makes no sense. And it's actually not good business to do the insider thing. When you can walk that line where it makes total sense to the casual viewer as well as the people who know what you're referring to, of course, he's the kind of guy that's so nasty he get booed at his own wedding. You don't have to know that actually happened to find that funny. He can work that kind of walking that tightrope as good as anyone on the mic right now. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing him call Mania.
Yes.
My match of the week, and this is where we'll bring it all to a close. But if you haven't seen Doug's match of Eddie and Okada, go see it. Also, go back to Raw if you haven't and watch DIY versus the Creed brothers. My goodness.
I mean,
the Creed brothers, man, they are the legit deal. I was a fan of theirs all the way back in the NXT days. I thought because of how good they are, honestly, I had presumed they would win this. I'm glad they didn't because they are so young. They will have many Mania moments, probably working towards the top of the tag team division. DIY have been around WWE for a decade. These two had legit never had a match on WrestleMania, even if it's a multi-tag team person mashup, which I'm not that crazy about. Johnny and Ciampa are on the Mania card and had a heck of a tag match with the Creed brothers.
Yeah, man, those Creed brothers are the real deal. I've been very removed from NXT for a while. It's just not my black and gold, but I think it might be. You've had these talks with me before, but seeing those Creed brothers come up to the main roster and the things they do and DIY, they are my black and gold, right? So.
Yeah. And they'll get their moment. And, no one's going to think they're the likely ones to run off into the sunset, but heck, they will have that moment at Mania, which is pretty special. And with that, Doug, man, you talk about special. This is no longer a drill. We are full on, man. It is Mania time. Next week's show, that's the preview. We are there. We will be previewing WrestleMania 40. Next Sunday at 8 live if you watch live here on Facebook, and then on demand on our Facebook and YouTube channels. And then we'll have 2 shows during Mania weekend. Best time of the year. Thank you for joining us to talk about the WWE Hall of Fame. Let us know what you think of the inductees. Let us know if you're older or younger than Doug and who you do and do not remember.
It really, age has nothing to do with who I remember. I'm really not sure what your name is, but fortunately you put it up here for me so I don't forget.
That's the only reason that's up there is for you, my friend.
I appreciate that.
We appreciate you guys, everyone, for tuning in. Two Bros Wrestling Show. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.